Imagine being forced to apologize in front of your entire neighborhood just for planting flowers. That's exactly what happened to my wife. Until we decided to fight back and take down the entire HOA board. It was supposed to be a normal Saturday morning. The kind of morning where the sun is just warm enough, the birds are chirping, and the world feels peaceful. My wife Emily was out in our front yard, kneeling in the soft earth, planting some new flowers she picked up from the local nursery. Gardening was her therapy, her escape from the stress of work and life. She'd spent the whole week planning which colors would go where, carefully arranging marigolds and petunias in neat little rows. Our front yard was her canvas, and she took so much pride in making it beautiful. I was inside, sipping my coffee and watching her through the window, smiling at how happy she looked. She had dirt on her cheek and a big floppy hat on her head, humming to herself as she worked. It was one of those moments you want to freeze in time. But that peace didn't last long. Suddenly, the air was pierced by a shrill, commanding voice. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" I looked up to see Karen, the president of our homeowners association, marching up our driveway like she owned the place. She had her ever-present clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, already snapping photos of Emily's flower beds before she even reached the yard. Karen was infamous in our neighborhood. She took her role as HOA president way too seriously, patrolling the streets like a self-appointed sheriff. She'd fine people for leaving their trash cans out too long, for having a flag that was too large, even for kids' bikes left on the lawn. But this was the first time she'd come after us. Emily stood up, brushing the dirt off her knees, and tried to greet Karen with a smile. "Good morning, Karen. I'm just planting some flowers. Aren't they pretty?" Karen didn't even look at the flowers. She was too busy scribbling notes on her clipboard. "Those aren't HOA-approved plants," she barked, her voice echoing down the street. "You know the rules. Only approved species are allowed in front yards. I'm going to have to write you up for this." Emily was taken aback. "They're just marigolds and petunias," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "They're not invasive or anything. I checked the guidelines and it just says to keep things tidy and well-maintained." But Karen wasn't listening. She was already snapping more photos, getting close-ups of the flowers like they were evidence in a crime scene. "The guidelines are very clear," she insisted, waving her clipboard like a badge of authority. "If it's not on the approved list, it has to go. I'll be issuing a fine, and you'll need to remove these immediately." I could see Emily's hands start to shake. She hated confrontation, and Karen was relentless. "Karen, please," Emily tried again. "These flowers aren't hurting anyone. They're just for a bit of color. I promise I'll keep everything neat." But Karen's face was already turning red. "Rules are rules," she snapped. "If everyone just did whatever they wanted, this neighborhood would be a mess. I'm not going to argue about this. You have until the end of the day to remove these, or you'll be fined. And if you don't comply, there will be further consequences." Emily looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. I could feel my own anger rising, but I tried to stay calm for her sake. "Karen, can we at least talk about this?" I asked, stepping outside. "Maybe there's a misunderstanding." But Karen was already turning on her heel, storming back down the driveway. "You'll regret this," she called over her shoulder, her voice dripping with menace. "I'll be reporting this to the board." As she disappeared down the street, Emily sank down onto the grass, her hands covering her face. I knelt beside her, putting my arm around her shoulders. "Don't worry," I whispered. "We'll figure this out. She can't just bully us like this." But even as I said it, I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. I knew Karen, and I knew she wouldn't let this go. What started as a peaceful Saturday morning had turned into the beginning of a nightmare. And as I looked at Emily's beautiful flowers, I realized that this was about more than just marigolds and petunias. It was about standing up for ourselves and for our right to make our home our own. We thought that was the end of it. After Karen's dramatic exit, we figured she'd cool off, maybe send us a warning letter or slap us with a small fine. We even joked about it that night, trying to lighten the mood. Emily tried to focus on her work, and I did my best to reassure her that it would all blow over. But deep down I could tell she was still shaken. She kept glancing out the window at her flowers, as if expecting them to be ripped out at any moment. 2 days later, our sense of normalcy was shattered again. I was checking my email before heading to bed when I saw a message from the HOA board. Subject line in all caps. Urgent. Community guideline violation. My stomach dropped. I called Emily over and together we read the email. It was cold and formal, full of legal jargon and threats. According to the board, Emily had willfully violated the community's landscaping guidelines by planting unauthorized flowers. But that wasn't the worst part. The email went on to say that, as a consequence, Emily was required to attend the next HOA meeting and issue a public apology to the entire neighborhood for disregarding community standards and setting a poor example for fellow residents. If she refused, the board warned, we would face escalating fines, possible legal action, and even a lien on our home. The message was clear: comply or suffer the consequences. Emily was mortified. She's always been a quiet, private person, the kind who avoids the spotlight at all costs. The idea of standing up in front of a room full of neighbors and apologizing for something as innocent as planting flowers was humiliating. She felt like a criminal, singled out and shamed for something that, in any other context, would have been celebrated. We spent the next few days in a state of anxiety. Emily barely slept, replaying the situation over and over in her mind. She kept asking me if we should just give in, pay the fines and let it go. But I could see how much it was hurting her, how unfair it all was. I tried to reassure her, telling her that we'd get through it together, but I felt powerless. The HOA board had all the authority, and Karen seemed determined to make an example out of us. The night of the meeting arrived, and Emily was a bundle of nerves. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple blouse and slacks, hoping to look respectful and contrite. I offered to go with her, but the board's email had made it clear that only the offending party was required to attend. I watched her walk out the door, her shoulders hunched, and felt a surge of anger at the people who had put her in this position. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a place that usually hosted birthday parties and holiday gatherings. But that night it felt more like a courtroom. Emily told me later that the room was packed, with neighbors filling every seat and standing along the walls. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, with Karen in the center, arms crossed and a smug smile on her face. When it was Emily's turn, she stood up, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the piece of paper the board had given her. The apology was already written out, full of phrases like, I deeply regret my actions, and I promise to uphold the standards of our community in the future. Emily's voice trembled as she read it aloud, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others judgmental. When she finished, there was an awkward silence. Karen nodded, satisfied, and the board moved on to the next agenda item as if nothing had happened. Emily sat back down, fighting back tears. A few neighbors leaned over to whisper words of support, telling her not to let it get to her, that everyone knew Karen was out of line. But the damage was done. Emily felt humiliated, her confidence shattered. When she got home, she broke down in tears. I held her, furious at the board for what they'd done. It wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about dignity, about standing up to bullies who used their power to control and intimidate. That night, as I comforted Emily, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let this stand. I would fight back, not just for Emily, but for everyone in our neighborhood who'd ever been pushed around by the HOA. This was just the beginning. That night, after Emily had finally fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee and a stack of HOA documents I'd printed from the community website. I was angry, angrier than I'd been in a long time. Seeing Emily so humiliated, so broken down by something as trivial as planting flowers, had lit a fire in me. I knew I couldn't just let it go. If the board could do this to her, they could do it to anyone. I started with the HOA's bylaws, a thick document full of legalese and fine print. I read every word, highlighting anything that mentioned landscaping, fines, or disciplinary actions. The more I read, the more confused, and then outraged, I became. The rules about plants were vague at best. There was a list of suggested species, but nowhere did it say that only those plants were allowed. The guidelines simply said that yards should be well-maintained and in harmony with the community aesthetic. There was nothing about marigolds or petunias being forbidden. I moved on to the section about violations and penalties. The process was supposed to be clear. a written warning, a chance to correct the issue, and then, if necessary, a fine. Nowhere did it mention public apologies. In fact, the only mention of meetings was that homeowners had the right to attend and speak at them, not that they could be forced to stand up and apologize for minor infractions. The more I read, the more it became clear that the board had overstepped their authority in a big way. But I didn't stop there. I dug into the minutes from past HOA meetings, which were all posted online. I read through 5 years' worth of notes, looking for any pattern of behavior. It didn't take long to spot it. Karen's name came up again and again, always in connection with complaints, fines, and disciplinary actions. There were stories of people being fined for having the wrong color mailbox, for leaving a garden hose out, for putting up holiday decorations too early. In one meeting, a homeowner had been called out for having a non-conforming bird feeder and was made to remove it in front of the entire board. As I read, I started to see a pattern. Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was using them as a weapon. She seemed to target certain homeowners, especially those who spoke up or questioned her authority. The fines were often excessive, and the public shaming was a recurring theme. It was clear that Karen enjoyed her power, and the rest of the board either supported her or were too intimidated to stand up to her. By the time the sun started to rise, I had a thick folder of notes and printouts. I knew I needed help, so I started searching for lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes. I found one with great reviews and a reputation for standing up to overreaching boards. I sent him an email, explaining our situation and attaching everything I'd found. He called me back that afternoon. After listening to our story and reviewing the documents, he confirmed what I'd suspected. The board had acted way outside their legal boundaries. Forcing Emily to apologize publicly wasn't just unfair. It was a violation of her rights as a homeowner. The vague rules about plants wouldn't hold up in court, and the pattern of excessive fines and public shaming could be considered harassment. The lawyer told me that we had a strong case, not just for getting the fines and apology overturned, but for holding the board accountable for their actions. He explained that HOAs have to follow their own rules and state laws, and when they don't, homeowners have the right to fight back. He also mentioned that we weren't alone. He'd handled cases just like ours, where power-hungry board members tried to bully residents into submission. Armed with this new knowledge, I started talking to our neighbors. I wanted to know if anyone else had experienced similar treatment. The response was overwhelming. People shared stories of being fined for tiny infractions, of being called out in meetings, of feeling powerless against Karen and her allies. Some were afraid to speak up, worried about retaliation. Others were just tired of the constant stress. It became clear that this wasn't just about Emily's flowers. It was about a pattern of abuse and intimidation that had gone on for far too long. I realized that if we didn't stand up now, it would only get worse. With the lawyer's help, I started gathering statements from other homeowners, building a case not just for ourselves, but for the whole community. That night, as I sat with Emily and told her what I'd found, I saw a spark of hope in her eyes. For the first time since this ordeal began, she smiled. We weren't alone, and we weren't powerless. We were ready to fight back. With my lawyer's help, I filed a lawsuit against the entire HOA board for emotional distress, abuse of power, and violation of our homeowner rights. It was a bold move, and I'll admit, I was nervous. But after everything Emily had been put through, I knew it was the right thing to do, not just for us, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had suffered in silence. Word spread quickly. At first, it was just a few curious glances and whispered conversations as people walked their dogs or picked up their mail. But soon, neighbors started stopping by our house, some with cautious questions, others with stories of their own. It was as if our lawsuit had broken a dam that had been holding back years of frustration and resentment. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, told us about the time she was fined for having a small garden gnome in her flower bed. It was a gift from my granddaughter, she said, her voice trembling with anger. Karen said it was tacky and not in keeping with the community's image. I paid the fine, but I never forgot how humiliated I felt. Another neighbor, the Johnsons, shared how they had been forced to repaint their front door 3 times in one summer because Karen didn't like the shade of blue they had chosen. She kept saying it clashed with the houses on either side, Mr. Johnson explained. We spent hundreds of dollars and countless hours, all because of her personal taste. It was exhausting. As more stories came out, it became clear that Karen's reign of control had touched almost everyone in the neighborhood in some way. People had been fined for wind chimes, for leaving their trash cans out a few hours too long, for having a welcome mat that was too bright. Some had even been called out in meetings, forced to defend themselves in front of their neighbors for the smallest infractions. The lawsuit put the board on the defensive. For the first time, Karen and her allies seemed unsure of themselves. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of the usual smug confidence, the board members looked nervous, glancing at each other and shuffling their papers. Karen, who usually dominated the room with her sharp voice and sharper glare, seemed subdued. The room was packed. More neighbors than I'd ever seen at a meeting showed up, filling every chair and lining the walls. Some people brought their kids. Others came straight from work, still in their uniforms. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something big to happen. My lawyer stood up and presented our case. He spoke calmly but firmly, laying out the facts. The board had no authority to demand public apologies. Their enforcement of the rules was arbitrary and inconsistent, and their actions had caused real emotional harm. He cited the bylaws, pointed out the lack of clear guidelines, and referenced the stories of other homeowners who had been targeted. As he spoke, I looked around the room and saw people nodding in agreement. Some whispered to their neighbors, others took notes. When my lawyer finished, he invited anyone who had experienced similar treatment to speak up. At first, there was a moment of hesitation. Then Mrs. Thompson stood up, her voice shaking but determined, and told her story about the garden gnome. The Johnsons followed, then the Millers, then the Changs. One by one, people stood up and shared their experiences, their voices growing stronger with each story. Karen tried to interrupt, insisting that the board was only trying to maintain standards, but the crowd wasn't having it. People pushed back, demanding answers, asking why the rules seemed to change depending on who you were. The board members looked overwhelmed, clearly unprepared for the wave of opposition. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that things had changed. The board was no longer in control. The community had found its voice, and people were no longer afraid to speak up. As we left the clubhouse that night, neighbors patted us on the back, thanked us for standing up, and promised to support us however they could. The lawsuit was still ongoing, but for the first time, I felt hopeful. We had started something bigger than ourselves. We had shown the board and Karen that they couldn't bully people into submission forever. The neighborhood was coming together, and I knew we were on the path to real change. After weeks of tense legal back and forth, the board finally caved. The pressure from the lawsuit, the mounting stories from neighbors, and the growing sense of unity in the community had become too much for them to handle. They agreed to settle out of court, hoping to avoid the embarrassment and expense of a public trial. The terms were clear. Emily would receive a formal, written apology from the board, all fines and disciplinary actions against us would be dropped, and the board would review and clarify the community's landscaping guidelines to prevent this kind of abuse from happening again. When the letter of apology arrived, Emily read it with tears in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of relief and vindication. The board admitted they had overstepped their authority and acknowledged the emotional distress they had caused. It wasn't just a victory for us. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of unfair rules and unchecked authority. But for the neighborhood, the apology and the drop fines weren't enough. The lawsuit had opened everyone's eyes to just how much power the board, and especially Karen, had wielded over the years. People were tired of living in fear of arbitrary fines, public shaming, and the constant feeling that their homes weren't really their own. The next HOA election became the most hotly contested in the community's history. Neighbors who had never attended a meeting before showed up in droves, determined to make their voices heard. Candidates ran on platforms of fairness, transparency, and respect for homeowners' rights. There were debates, flyers, and even a community barbecue where people could meet the candidates and ask questions. The energy was electric. For the first time, people felt like they had a real say in how their neighborhood was run. When the votes were counted, the results were decisive. Karen and her closest allies were voted out, replaced by a new board made up of people who genuinely cared about the community. The new president was a retired teacher who believed in listening to everyone's concerns, not just enforcing rules for the sake of control. The first thing the new board did was hold an open forum, inviting residents to share their ideas and grievances. They promised to review all the HOA's policies, making sure they were clear, reasonable, and applied equally to everyone. Almost overnight, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. People started chatting more at the mailbox, waving to each other as they walked their dogs, and even organizing block parties and potlucks. The fear and tension that had hung over the community for so long began to lift. Homeowners felt empowered to ask questions, suggest improvements, and even plant a few extra flowers without worrying about a fine or a nasty letter. Emily's flowers, the ones that started it all, are still blooming in our front yard, brighter and more beautiful than ever. She's added new varieties, and neighbors often stop by to admire her handiwork or ask for gardening tips. What was once a source of stress and conflict has become a symbol of resilience and hope. Looking back, I realize that sometimes standing up to a bully takes more than just courage. It takes a community coming together. If we had tried to fight the board alone, we might have been ignored or steamrolled. But when our neighbors joined us, when people started sharing their own stories and demanding change, we became unstoppable. We learned that our voices mattered, and that together, we could make our neighborhood a better place. As for Karen, she didn't stick around to see the changes she had fought so hard to prevent. A few months after the new board took over, she quietly put her house up for sale and moved away. There was no farewell party, no tearful goodbyes, just a collective sigh of relief. The only thing left of her reign is a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when one person's power goes unchecked. Now, when I walk through our neighborhood, I see more than just houses and lawns. I see a community that stood up for itself, that refused to be bullied, and that learned the importance of fairness and respect. I see neighbors who look out for each other, who aren't afraid to speak up, and who know that their voices matter. And every time I see Emily tending to her flowers, I'm reminded that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance, like planting a marigold, can lead to the biggest changes. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life neighborhood drama, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss an update. And if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA or a neighborhood Karen, share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear it.